Although it rarely ends up on American news these days, if you're a civilian in Iraq, it remains an incredibly dangerous place to be. A new United Nations report recorded the killings of 18,802 people, civilians, and almost twice as many wounded between the beginning of 2014 and the end of October 2015, roughly the period of time in which in that region ISIS has been sort of the driving force of violence, particularly against civilians. Now, again, the United Nations report does not solely put the onus on ISIS as the driver of the violence. There are other groups as well, but in regards to ISIS, it refers to that group as a scourge and says it has committed acts that may, in some cases, amount to war crimes. May, really. Crimes against humanity and possibly genocide. Well, I think they've probably reached it at this point. The United Nations is a notoriously conservative organization when it comes to labeling things as what they are, apparently.
Well, I mean, genocide is a big thing for the United Nations to get to. And so whatever they say leading up to it, the headline there is that they use the word genocide, even
that's true.
Possibly
even if there are some conditionals.
Yeah, then it changes the whole metric of how they approach it and how the world approaches it and how legal approaches it. But nonetheless, and
that's true. I'm being too hard on
today. Did you know that ISIS? I don't know if it was today. Actually, I read about it today. They're cutting their pay.
We talked about that yesterday. In half.
Right.
Yeah.
We lose our network. They just lose half their pay because of the price of oil.
They're sticking in there, though.
It's all by the price. But yeah.
Exactly.
But yeah, no.
Yeah, tough time for them.
But that is a defining line when they start using the word genocide, because it does change.
That's true.
You know, you could say it's only words, and what does it really change? Because they're fairly ineffectual about it. But I do think that that I haven't heard that yet.
Yeah. No. I mean, we know
I don't even know if it's accurate. So.
Well, I don't know that it is necessarily. We're basically going with this new information. But if you listen to various Republican candidates for the presidency, the only time they seem to really care about what happens purely overseas in that area is when you refer to the persecution and killing of the Yazidis, because they have the benefit of being Christians. If there's a genocide, then maybe that will lead us to send in tens of thousands of ground troops, which would be another disaster. Now, 19,000 almost is obviously disastrous. The actual number, however, is almost certainly higher. The report notes the number of civilian casualties could be much higher than recorded because international agencies face difficulties in verifying incidents and accounting for those who died because of lack of access to basic food, water, or medical care. They are referring to people who died in acts of actual violence as opposed to from the byproducts and after effects of that violence. Now, in addition to just the killed and the wounded, you have hundreds of children that have been forced to take up arms and fight alongside their militant captors under the threat of being flogged, tortured, or raped. You have about 3,500 Yazidi women and children who have been coerced into sexual slavery, sold to Islamic State fighters for between $500 and $2,000, or given out as prizes in Quran memorization competitions. And in addition, I mean, here we're talking about ISIS. If we refer to the casualties as a result of some of the international efforts to fight back against ISIS, you have airstrikes targeting civilian infrastructure that are thought to have been commandeered by Islamic State forces that have resulted in hundreds of casualties, according to the report, which acknowledges that ISIL deliberately bases itself in civilian areas and uses civilians and civilian infrastructure as shields. Now, that's the hundreds that the UN is comfortable identifying, while the U.S. Central Command acknowledges only 7 instances of civilian casualty events. That, by the way, is actually better than most countries which have not been willing to acknowledge any civilian deaths as a result of their airstrikes.
Yeah, the Russians in particular. There was the general was on the radio this morning.
I did not see that.
And they conducted over 6,000 air raids since their involvement, and they are categorical in the fact that they have had 0 civilian.
And we've seen news reports of markets being blown up. Like,
no. There's 0.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know,
the 0 is how many fucks they give about how many civilians they've killed. That's the 0.
And you know, and also we've all talked, and we don't need to revisit it, but we've talked about the extent to which the legitimate targets, how they're defining militants versus how other people define radical militants. So, I can well believe that the collateral damage, it's an awful phrase, but the collateral damage to civilian casualties is far higher than these estimates.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting about ISIS is it's not the sheer weight of the numbers, because it's almost as though you watch it, and you know, we talked jokingly a little bit about it in a macabre way, gallows humor, like 19 to 19,000, but it kind of feels a bit like that sometimes. You almost become deadened to it a little bit, and it's those horrific images of how some of these individuals have died
No question. With ISIS, that's the case.
You know, how it's carried out and how that punishment is meted out is actually the thing that really grabs our attention as much as a stat.
No, no question. And that's the only thing that does at this point. I mean, even you know, even with these school shootings, it was numb, kindergarten.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah, exactly.
Then numb again. And so we have become numb to these things, and that's true. I think that's what the pure torture and the ugliness of. I mean, how can it be more ugly? But then you look at this, and I say this facetiously, but when you see what life is like there, it's almost like death is not better, but the two aren't very different. They're slaves. I mean, not just children being forced into fighting, but people being forced into slavery, women being forced into sex. I mean, the life there is so unimaginably bad.
Yeah.
It's hard to you know. So again, we look at the death and we're shocked by it and numb to it, and then we look at the life and we're also shocked and numb by it as well.
And then the moral imperative, and we've talked about this a lot, but the moral imperative on the, for countries, Western powers, to take in these refugees, it's inescapable.
Yeah.
And yet again, you talk the numbers are just unimaginable.
Yeah.
1.1 million in Germany last year. You know, all the numbers that we're all familiar with. 200,000 in Sweden. I mean, it's just an unimaginable. The scale is just unimaginable.
Yeah, I mean, you have inside of just Iraq, we see in this report, 3.2 million people displaced just within the borders. Syria obviously having an even larger number. And of course, we have two different situations there, but the situations share the fact that they're absolutely horrific for the people there. I mean, a lot of news has thankfully been made, because this was shocking enough, that there are entire communities surviving barely on grass soup in some areas of Syria. And I mean, just absolutely horrendous inside of Iraq. One of the reasons we have this block of stories, the attack in Pakistan and then the UN report about Iraq, is although the groups are different, I mean, you get to 19,000 civilians dead in Iraq through countless acts, not that dissimilar from the attack on the university in Pakistan. And it's newsworthy in Pakistan. It's the daily life in Iraq. And when I think back to, and I know that this is, when I think about the origins of TYT, I think about the war in Iraq, and I think about that was sort of the political situation relatively early on when the show was broadcasting, and the debate about whether we should go. And the idea that if you could just go back there and talk to people who are like, fuck them, they hit us on 9/11, and say, okay, in 14 years, we're going to find out that in just 1 year, 19,000 civilians were killed. Like more than a decade after, you don't really care that much about what happened on a day-to-day basis. Just the acts of barbarity that will ripple out from our actions. Now, obviously, anything could have happened in Iraq in 14 years. God knows, Saddam Hussein could have been overthrown. It could have descended into chaos on its own. But we chose to get involved, and these actions are, to some extent, we bear responsibility for them. If it's 19,000 people in Iraq, if it's, to a lesser extent, the disruption of the Taliban could have theoretically led to the attack in Pakistan. That's a little bit harder to place. But we are linked to these events.
Indisputably, and we'll never know. We'll never know. My guess, my hunch is that Saddam Hussein would still be in power, but he wouldn't have weapons of mass. Wouldn't have weapons of mass destruction. He still wouldn't have weapons of mass destruction. He still wouldn't. There still wouldn't have been a direct link between him and what happened
9/11.
9/11. So it was. Not we all. A number of people, the relevant people, got whipped up into a frenzy. And we don't need to revisit that. But it's the blood of is still very much on those decision makers